are more than 100 unique styles of beer, each with their own set of ingredients, process, guidelines, history, and experience. If you're a beer lover, an industry leader, or somewhere in between, a better knowledge of beer style will improve your life and your work.
Welcome to A Sense of Beer Style, essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. I'm Julia Herz.
And I'm Jeremy Storton.
We're advanced Cicerones, beer judges, home brewers, and we're excited to guide you through the vast and wonderful world of beer styles.
Welcome, everyone. Here we go. Fruit beer as part of the 2021 Beer Judge Certification Program Style Guidelines. Yay for fruit, yay for beer, yay for yummy things, right?
Yeah, I'm ready. I've got my local beers ready to go.
Jeremy's fired up. I'm fired up. Hopefully you're fired up. Hopefully you have an example in your glass. And what we're going to do, and most of you that listen to Sense of Beer Style, you know we do one dedicated show for each individual beer style. When I introduce this show as fruit beer, there's 4 individual styles under the category of fruit beer. Today for you, we're going to do 3 because we feel strongly that grape ale, that 4th style within fruit beer, is kind of on its own. And what we've got here in this show under the fruit beer category is 3 of 4. We've got fruit beer as a dedicated style, fruit and spice beer, and then specialty fruit beer. So that is this show today. We thank you for joining us. We're very excited. And I kind of want to set the stage on, if you're listening to this, to dial in on what fruit beer is all about. Again, you can just have a dedicated fruit beer, which is a beautiful marriage and balance of fruit with beer. Or you can have fruit and spice, that is a beer. And then the specialty fruit beer is usually it has to have fruit, and then often has added adjuncts, ingredients that are fermentables that make it more of a specialty fruit beer. But the big picture to kind of wrap your brain around is that there's so many different types of fruit. And when we think of fruit and beer, it's maybe not as common in many people's minds, right? But you go to look at great brewing nations, and we've got, German style Hefeweizens with not just Woodruff syrup, which is certainly more on the botanical side, but the raspberry syrup, right? We've got the addition of early brew pubs in the United States making wheat beers with raspberry and fruit. We've got the Belgians, who have taught us so much about adding fruit to amazing beers that create like creeks and lambics and the like, with raspberries and cherries and more. So the style guidelines really make a big deal about the culinary definition of fruit, and they talk about the kind of plethora. You've got palm fruit, stone fruit, right? Berries. You've got citrus style or tropical style fruit. Dried fruits. So there's no end to what you could do to get a world-class example of a fruit beer, no matter the subcategory, for the style category. How's that for a kickoff?
I think that's a great kickoff. In fact, once upon a time, I told myself and others that I'm not really into fruit in my beer, and then I kept finding examples that contradicted my stance. And I've really become a huge fan of fruit beers. And so to kick them off, and I'll kick off ingredients and process, it's real simple. But first of all, let's talk about what they're not. Fruit beers, according to this category 29, A, B, and C, they are not beers with like fruit juice added to them, like a Radler, for example. That'd be something else entirely, and that's something we'll talk about later on, different Stylecast. A fruit beer is something legitimately with fruit that you would eat put into the beer. And the way that they define fruit, it's basically something that you would consider fruit without hesitation. They even go so far as to say that anything that you would, if you were describing this to a friend, say, well, this is technically, air quotes, a fruit. That's not what this style is for. If you're like, well, okay, tomato is technically a fruit, no, that they're not going there with that. This is banana. This is pineapple. This is guava. This is orange. This is anything that where if like you're a fruit and don't even think twice, that's fruit. The other thing that this fruit beer style is not is there are a few other categories that we've already talked about that have fruit, like a fruited lambic, for example. That is a separate category. If you
Yes.
have a fruited wild ale, that is a separate category. If it's a fruited sour ale, that's a separate category. To really dial these styles in, these are, for lack of better words, technically ordinary styles, classic styles, with the addition of fruit or fruit and spice or fruit and some other specialty ingredient or process. So let's break that down. So with ingredients, we have to go back to our previous style casts, and whatever the base style is, everything is going to depend on that base style. And like, for example, the one in my hand, this is a straight kettle sour that we've talked about in a previous beer style. They just added fruit to it. So this would be a fruit or they can add fruit or spices and spices, excuse me, or it could be fruit and other adjuncts, like you mentioned, different adjuncts. But it could be honey, could be brown sugar, could be lactose, could be alternative grains. It could be a special process that maybe they did a decoction mashed doppelbock, for example, with some sort of fruit. That would be fun, but there's a special process that goes in along with that. Could be oak, could be other type of aging process. Um, and I find it interesting that these are broken down in detail. It's not surprising, but Julia, you and I have both judged competitions, and usually anything with fruit is getting lumped into like one general category, and we'd see it all across the board. So, but the BJCP likes to specify; they like to be specific and deliberate. And so, if you're going to enter a beer into any of these categories, you need to specify the base category. You need to specify the fruit and the spice and the specialty thing that you did to this. But otherwise, that's the ingredients of process for these is just understanding that they separate these out. And so that's our ingredients. I'm going to hold up my glass, Julia, and you talk about the appearance, and let's dive in a little bit deeper.
Sure. Sounds good. And great baton pass there. On appearance, if you read the style guidelines, and they're certainly free to download, bjcp.org. Jeremy and I are certified and in the program BJCP judges, but it's a all volunteer effort, amazing
Yeah.
nonprofit. And so find the guidelines, because in the case of this, and it's a little trickier because we normally do one show per individual style. In this, we're doing one show on 3 of the 4 individual styles within fruit beer, but under appearance, as other areas of the sensory that we're going to overview, it says the same thing for fruit beer, for fruit and spice, and for specialty fruit beer. So under appearance, it's going to vary based on the style. Now, entrance, if you're entering these into competition, you can either denote the base beer style, which is always a little dangerous. I think when you have these catch-all categories, it's a pro tip. It's a little easier to not identify a base style, because then if that base style isn't really shining and or at least supporting as a star, then judges might ding you. So you could just avoid saying the base style and instead just say the ingredients that bring the beer to its place. You always definitely need to, though, designate the fruit. So once you have a beer in your glass, for appearance, the fruit's obviously going to usually affect the color, right? So that's a really important attribute. These styles don't even have specific vital statistics that they have to land within. That's cool,
Yeah.
because the style guidelines are open-minded there. So they can be light colored beers. They can be darker beers. Again, it just depends on the ingredients. The clarity can be variable, which is great. It's not saying that it has to be clear. Although haze, they say, is generally undesirable. I mean, that's a tough one. Haze is also relative. There's a spectrum of, I think, impression on what haze is to me, say what haze is to Jeremy, compared to whoever is listening. So just keep that in mind with a grain of salt. But they're looking not for fully clear beers, although they could be. It's just that you don't want them hazy, muddy. I'd rather use the word muddy, muddled, right? Haze is okay
Yeah.
to me. Haze is like pectin. Haze means it didn't get fully filtered. Like it's okay. But so I have a little bone to pick on that, but just good to point out. And then the collar foam and the head retention, right? That foam, that protein foam and the CO2, that is variable as well. You have some fruits that are oily, and some fruits that can actually affect the actual retention of the foam. So there's no expectations, at least in judging, on what type of head retention you're supposed to have.
Yeah. When we get to aroma, again, this is just real easy. You've got to know your base styles. It's all going to be variable and dependent upon that base style. Go back and listen to that Stylecast. Find one of those beers, listen, taste, and learn. But when we get to these fruit beers, fruit spice beers, fruit specialty beers, we're taking that base style for granted. We're just going to put that on the table. Everyone can see the base style discussion there. Now let's get into whatever the fruit is. It should be pretty characterful. I have had some where it's just been real subtle. If it's going to be a fruit beer, let's let it be a fruit beer. So with this, we're looking for a low to a high fruit character, but you should taste that fruit. You should smell that fruit. But whatever that fruit is, and here's the challenge to this. Like this beer in my hand is from Barbarian Brewing in Garden City, just north of Boise, Idaho. This is the Pina Colada. So we've got pineapple, we've got coconut. This is a perfect beer for a hot day. So I'm expecting pineapple, I'm expecting coconut. What if you get something like, and I've had this before, how about like a jackfruit Kolsch? Do you know what jackfruit smells and tastes like? If not, go find it at your store. If you can't find the fruit, then at least go find some of the candy so you have an idea of what it tastes like. Tamarind is another one that is fantastic in beer, but not everyone knows. So understand what that fruit character is, and just know that it can have a huge variability within that base style of beer. Now, with beers like that, typically they're going to bring the hops back a little bit because it's not about the hops. It's all about the fruit. There should be balance. There should be harmony in that aroma, but don't expect a lot in the way of hop when you start sniffing the rim of your glass. How does that translate to flavor?
It gets a little trickier in explaining flavor in a catch-all show that
Yeah.
covers 3 specific styles. But again, we're grounding you on fruit beer in containing fruit beer, fruit and spice, and specialty fruit beer, with specialty fruit beer being about additions of, say, fermentable adjuncts, as we've already said, or some type of grains or sweeteners that might just be out there and outliers that are supposed to be in concert with the fruit. So the flavor for fruit beer and fruit and spice, it says varies by style. That's very standard. And just like Jeremy covered with the aroma, the fruit flavors, you want them the star, but they don't have a designated intensity. Could be, subtle to aggressive, the style guidelines say. But the fruit character, it's not supposed to be contrived, right? You don't want it to taste like artificial candy sweetener. At least that's what they're looking for. You don't want it to be like a Hawaiian sea fruit punch, type of flavor.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is important to note. It will, with the fruits that are added, if you have the specialty fruit beer, kind of take things a touch further, and that the additives, those sweet sugar adjunct additives, they were going to impact the flavor even more. So that's just obvious, though, and yet something to note. And then the bitterness is going to vary based on the base style. Alcohol is going to vary. Tannins are going to vary, right?
Yeah.
Most fruits, if you're working with fruits, many people, certainly most fruits are de-pitted. So, often you don't have to de-seed, but the pits can contain things like cyanide and other things. So most people are pitting them, but the tannins from the skins, so they're not usually skinning them, or they might, but if you're not, you're going to have increased tannins. As long as that's in balance and in concert, and we'll get to mouthfeel, that's okay. But flavor is kind of this big ball of wax when you're brewing these, and if you're entering them into any competition, you're going to want to pay attention to what the style guidelines are allowing and looking for, and where the guidelines are setting up guardrails. And there's a little bit of nuance between the specialty fruit beer and compared to the fruit beer and the fruit and spice beers.
Yeah, and so when we get to mouthfeel, I mean, granted, again starting with our base style, know the base style, and know what to expect with that. But when you add fruit, that brings sugar. That sugar is likely going to ferment, and so it's going to uh, make the body a little bit lighter than what you'd expect for that base style. It's going to bring that alcohol up a little bit higher than you would expect for that base style. And a good example, the one I'm drinking, it's a kettle sour pina colada. If we have a basic kettle sour, kind of like a Berliner Weiss, that's going to be roughly 4% ABV. This one is 6% ABV. And I don't mean to get into vital stats right now, but that is going to bring a little bit more alcohol warmth, potentially. Not always there, but it can be there. And you just touched on this perfectly, Julia. When we get into different fruits, different spices, and different aspects of it, it can bring a few different things that are not in the base style, such as some tannins, such as some astringency, and these are things that you will detect when we get into mouthfeel. So notice the difference and know the difference between this variation you have and the base style, and it should be pretty fun and straightforward. Do you want to take a stab at style comparisons?
Yeah, and I'm reading up, and it is important. Again, if you're entering these in competition, you definitely want to refer to the style guidelines.
Yeah.
The guidelines are so broad here that they normally, when you read the guidelines, there's a section that says style comparison. There's no style comparison written here, but included in the overall comments, and Jeremy kind of touched on this in our intro. Basically, it's the catch-all minus a few exceptions. So if you have a fruit version of any classic style, or most of them, this is where it's going to end up, unless you're adding spice with the fruit, and then it's going to end up in fruit and spice as opposed to fruit beer. Or if you have a base style and you're adding fruit and certain types of sugars and the like, then it's going to end up in specialty. The key is remembering that lambic has a fruit lambic dedicated style, right? That fruited sour mixed fermentation that Jeremy talked about, and we did do a show on this, ends up in the wild specialty area for beer in that style.
Mm-hmm.
But classic styles with fruit, they mentioned Flanders, Old Bruin, Goza, Berliner should be entered in 29A fruit beer. So that is the catch-all for that. So you're paying attention to just where the style guidelines maybe break something out. It's very rare and few, and we've mentioned most of it. And otherwise, it's 29A fruit beer, 29B fruit and spice, or 29C specialty fruit beer. And then the outlier, we'll have a whole nother show on it, is the grape ale, which has, you're dedicated
Yeah.
working with grape as the fruit.
Yeah. And so when we get into commercial examples, I'm not going to read them all. You can look them up if you want, but there's a few that are standouts that many of you will likely have already seen, tasted, and are fairly easy to find. But for the straight fruit beer category, one of the classics is 21st Amendment watermelon wheat. Watermelon and wheat beer. I've had different breweries do that. It is a beautiful flavor combination. Anderson Valley Blood Orange Gosa, another beautiful combination. And most people know the Ballast Point Grapefruit Sculpin, incredible. Cherry Stout from Bell's. When we get in fruit and spice beer, we're looking at the Firestone Walker Chocolate Cherry Stout. And here's where the spice really comes in. Think about Golden Road Spicy Mango Cart, because they add a little bit of heat to that. And I mean, how fun is that? Sun King Orange Vanilla Sunlight. These are all things that we've seen. Especially fruit beers. I've just had this just the other day. The brewery Gosas are red. That is another beautiful beer. And if I remember correctly, please don't quote me on this, but I think they add some hibiscus to that as well, just to add that specialty to it. If you have any fruited milkshake IPAs with that lactose, that's likely going to fall under this category as well. So these are all fun things to try. They're great examples. Look them up, go find them. Just understand how these things are constructed, how they're slightly different, and then we'll move on from there. Julia, do you want to tap your foot on vital stats for these, or do you want to head straight to glassware?
Yeah, so we already mentioned that there are no vitals listed for guidelines from the BJCP, but if you're adding fruit, it should affect the color. That's going to
Yep.
denote it. The catch is that standard reference method or your brewing convention are like you're helpless as a judge when you're like you've
Yep.
got something that's coral colored, right? Rose colored. None of the numbers in those vitals account for those additional spectrum ranges for color. So it's a bit wonky there, but your vitals are open and fair game, so not to worry there. And yeah, we'll skip straight to glassware and temperature. And so it really is depending on which beer is in your glass, how much alcohol. Hopefully, if you're drinking beer, you started to realize that there's more than the U.S. shaker pint, and you experiment. And depending on which beer and which flavor profile and how much alcohol or ethanol you're having it in maybe a glass with a flare or a bump at the edge, something that's more bulbous that you can put your hands around and warm up. It just depends. So I don't feel at all, even though Jeremy and I are we're educators, but we're always on the journey to learn more. I, as an educator, don't feel like I should educate you on which glass because we don't even know which beer we're talking about. And so then that brings
Mhm.
me to serving temperature, which is also kind of wide open. If you want something drier and more refreshing, I like it colder, right? Straight out of the fridge cold. If it's got more ethanol or alcohol, a little beefier, a little heavier on the tongue and palate, then maybe a little bit warmer. So those are my general guidelines, but I'm going to cheat and not answer that at all, just because of the variability of the examples of fruit beers.
Well, and I'll add just a thought to that. I mean, grant, yes, your glassware is going to be variable. If in doubt, use the glassware that is associated with the base beer style. Yeah, that's a great place to start. Otherwise, again, I've said this before, fancy glasses are wonderful, but all we need to do is get liquid to lips. Especially if it's fruited, I want to smell the sucker, especially on a hot day. And I've got pineapple, coconut. There are few things finer in this life than these flavors in my glass right now. So I want a glass that is going to taper in and hold whatever it has to hold. Foam wise, which this has none, but I want to taper out because I want that jet engine for aroma to my nose, and this really helps. So I do like I do like a little bit of flair in my glass.
I like that jet engine. Yeah, because it will concentrate, right? It'll take the
Yeah,
volatiles and really push it sometimes towards your orthonasal and retronasal passages.
yeah.
Good one. Good
Yeah,
one.
and I do agree with these. It is nicer to have them a little bit colder as they warm up. Not all fruits are meant to be warm, and they express differently. So, if in doubt, I'm going to keep it right around the 40-degree range or 5 degrees Celsius range, and then we can play from there. More importantly, what about pairing? What would you pair with these?
Right. So, I mean, you could start or I could start, but again, I'm going to take the cheat on it depends. And so I'll just go with the basics of when I'm pairing. I'm looking for certain things. Half the pairing battle is intensity. I think if you have a match in intensity as rich and dense the food might be, you want a bigger, more robust beer. And then the other part of pairing, and I mean, there's no right or wrong rules because sensory is so individual and personalized. I always say perception's personal, so too is pairing. But the other part of pairing besides intensity I'm looking for are those complements, right? Things contrast, right? Carbonation CO2 contrasts against, oleogustus or fat, right? That is true. Tannins from the skins of the grapes, they contrast against, say, foods, also fat and also salinity. So it's so relative, but I'm looking for the complements in food. That always helps me with successful pairings. Does the beer that you are trying to pair to a food have any complements or bridges or hooks or links, those words I always say, that are similar, right? Those flavor harmonies, right? Is there any essence of, say, dates or figs in your beer? And then what is going on? Are there pecans in flavor or cashews, right? You can see synergies in the food with those two things, cashews and pecans, that would tie and match to, figs and dates. So look for bridges, links, and hooks. And that's the fun journey of pairing is you try it and then you tweak the food, you amp things up, give it more salt, give it a little more umami, or
Yeah.
switch out the food dish or switch out the beer.
Yeah. And again, this is also variable because fruit beers are variable. But just as you laid down a perfect way to think about how to approach this. I really love playing with contrasts. Yes, there are going to be complements and hooks involved with that. Like for example, like a cherry stout with some butter cookies or shortbreads. That would be just fantastic because there's a little bit of bridge there from the malt to the cookie, but just that contrast of this tart cherry and this buttery cookie would be fantastic. But on any given day, if you hand me a fruited beer of any kind, chances are, I want it on a hot day. This is a fantastic replacement for if you're having white wine, particularly Sauvignon Blanc. This is a fantastic replacement for champagne or mimosas for brunch. So anything you would eat with those things would go well with these beers. I'm leaning on tacos really hard on this one, Julia. I'm leaning on grilled chicken salad or a niçoise salad would be fantastic with a lot of these fruit beers, particularly this pina colada that I have in my hand would be fantastic with any of that.
Yep. So have fun, go forth. This is a really great um, category of individual beer styles. And I think beer has earned enough cred where you hear the term fruit beer and you're not turning your nose down at
Yeah.
it. There's so much snobbery when it comes to fruit. Like grape is a fruit, but that's not the only fruit. So wine assumes often in the wine world that we're just talking about grapes, where I'm always raising my hand of like, well, look at the TTB in the United States. They tax wineries as fermenting fruit, not just grapes. And so it's just a great example of where beer can take sensory because of the array of fruit available to work with. And anytime I'm drinking a fruit beer, I am in and I want to get to know it and find out what the brewer's approach was because I'm usually very pleasantly surprised. And I often discover new fruits that I hadn't even been exposed to, which is a bonus too.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, find them, enjoy them. Cheers.
Cheers, everybody.
Thank you for listening to A Sense of Beer Style, the essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. With advanced Cicerones, me, Julia,
And me, Jeremy.
Tune into the next episode as we continue exploring the world of beer styles and what to make of them. We encourage you to listen to the prepisodes to build your foundation and better understand beer styles.
And before the next episode, I'd like to ask you to review the show and let us know what you'd like featured in upcoming episodes. Until next time, here's to you and your sense of beer style. Thank you for listening. Cheers.